to our free online webinar series called Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series close to 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. We are pleased to offer these webinars thanks to the generous support of our sponsor, the Boeing Company. Today, we have speaking Justice Bobbe Bridge, founding president and CEO of the Center for Children and Youth Justice. Justice Bridge will describe how schools can engage troubled youth in strong relationships with caring adults. Before we begin, I'll give you a little background on Justice Bobbe Bridge. She has spent nearly 20 years as a judge, state Supreme Court justice, and child advocate. Justice Bridge knows how systems work and don't work. Since founding Center for Children and Youth Justice in 2006, she has been the driving force behind the organization's strategic leadership, developing and implementing innovative, evidence-based, sustainable reforms in the juvenile justice system and foster care system. Justice Bridge works to build critical community partnerships among leaders and stakeholders who work together for breakthrough results in systems change. She currently co-chairs the Washington State Supreme Court Commission on Children in Foster Care and has been honored with numerous awards for her civic involvement, philanthropy, and service to children and youth. So before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. You'll notice a chat function on the right side of your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or on email via info@educationvoters.org. With that, I'd like to welcome Justice Bridge.
Thanks, Kelly. As the title implies, we're going to be talking in these next few minutes, about a specific partnership, a partnership between the education system and the juvenile justice system to support youth who are in crisis. So the problem as we address it here is about disengagement from school. Every absence, excused or unexcused, is a learning opportunity lost and can have significant impacts on a student's success in school and life. A student who misses 10% or more of their school days, for example, which is really about 18 or more days in a single school year, which doesn't sound like a whole lot to us. It's just 2 days a month. But for any reason, such an absence is considered chronically absent, and that chronically absent students are more likely to fall behind in reading and math, less likely to graduate from high school, and are more likely to drop out. So addressing chronic absenteeism, or as we call it, more informally, truancy, and developing good attendance habits is a solvable problem for which we must all share responsibility. A particular problem arises when this issue of chronic absenteeism or truancy intersects with juvenile justice involvement. It has been shown by research for well over 20 years now, almost approaching the 30-year mark, that youth who disengage from school by not showing up, whether temporarily or permanently, are at great risk to enter the juvenile justice system. But plans and youth who transition out of secure confinement, which they may be placed in during an episode with the juvenile justice system, encounter substantial challenges in gaining employment, finding housing, getting an education, and accessing medical and mental health care. Plans are rarely in place to support youth as they attempt to move past their convictions or their confinement. It's a downward spiral that continues to homelessness, unemployment, adult incarceration. What a tragic loss of human potential. But all need not be bleak. The schools can be that stabilizing influence, that reconnecting influence. The data that will illustrate the general statements that I've just made are really compelling. The 4-year graduation rates, first of all, for youth of color, American Indian, 53%, African American and Black, approximately 68%, special ed kids at 56%, all low-income kids at about 66%, for homeless youth, hovering at 46%, although getting better, and for kids in foster care at 41%, but getting better. Match that to incarceration rates. Youth of color who are in the juvenile rehabilitation system, which is state custody. We picked two, for example. American Indians are at 4.2% graduation rate. Black and African Americans, 21.6%. That compares to their population, their rate in the population of 2% for for American Indian youth and 4% for Black youth. Mental health also complicates this situation. Only 60% of kids who present themselves in the juvenile justice system graduate. And Washington graduation rates for kids who are incarcerated, as we were talking about just a moment ago, juveniles with any disposition whatsoever, meaning they could have been subject to a misdemeanor sentence at the local county level, graduate at the rate of 23%. Any local sanctions, that's to say they're put on probation, their graduation rate drops to 13%. And for JR kids, again, those kids that are in the state system, the graduation rate is on average 16%. The investment in education clearly is cost effective. In 2014-15 academic year, per student education dollars in Washington state, which were lower than the national average, and I don't want to get into that about state funding right now, but was approximately $10,325 per kid. That same youth, in order to be incarcerated in the state of Washington, costs $95,805 per year. The marginal cost of operation of a kid who comes into the juvenile detention facility in a local community, in a county, costs $20,515 a year. Seems to me that education, which we know is linked to stabilizing these kids, and the reverse, we've been talking more about the reverse, but for the positive side, education can be linked to stabilizing kids by keeping them in school, looks by these numbers to be a bargain. Our failure to invest smartly at this education level costs millions or billions more on the back end issues of incarceration, mental health, unemployment, family dysfunction, and substance abuse. So what we know now, that education is the great stabilizer, that school is the most likely place for a child to feel part of his or her community, that education can be the most efficient and effective tool to ameliorate the disadvantages and risk factors that we talked about. But the education system cannot do it alone, particularly meeting the needs for social and emotional learning within these youth. And more about that in a few minutes. So what do we know? Well, the Bobbe Bill, which passed in 1995, was a first attempt at this kind of cross-system collaboration. We knew that dropping out of school, even having a number of chronic absenteeisms, or being chronically absent from school, or truant, as we call it in the statute, led one to be in the juvenile justice system at staggering rates. So we knew that, and we knew that, well, why don't we pay attention to those rates and intervene earlier, pay attention to those kids who were not in school, and collaborating, having the juvenile justice system take a stronger role in ensuring that those students were recognized and that some kind of intervention was given in collaboration with the school districts to ensure that the child would return to school. It is an effort to intervene so that it would prevent the disengagement which truancy, which happens with truancy. Unfortunately, like with a lot of things, the Bobbe Bill and the attendant services was never adequately funded. Yet through intersystem partnerships, creativity, and innovation, it has made a difference. We've moved the needle on school attendance and graduation rates, and we've reduced juvenile justice involvement, even in those highly impacted subpopulation of kids of color. So to implement the mission of the Bobbe Bill, which was to intervene early to reduce truancy, reduce absenteeism, to keep kids out of court and in school, The Becca Task Force was formed in 2002 by myself and then King County prosecuting attorney Norm Mailing to bring these two very diverse systems together. We had been under the Becca law for about 7 years then, and frankly, it was a bumpy beginning. I often talked about it as a shotgun marriage, but nobody really understands what that is anymore. But in other words, something you're compelled to do that you really don't want to do. There was very little trust. We were not even speaking the same language. We did not understand each other's processes, and there was the ever popular fighting for the same dollar bill from the state budget. And in some instances, although not many, I am happy to say, but in some instances, the little secret, the dark secret, was that some educators and some educational situations were happy to be done with these kids, especially when those kids did much to disrupt the classroom work, and when high stakes testing came in, they certainly dragged down the overall work of other kids, overall results from other kids in the school building. So the membership of this task force came together: educators, courts, all folks from courts, judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, child advocates, community-based organizations, and some legislators, local as well as state legislators, all from all around the state, meeting every month, or every other month in some periods of time, to learn a lot together. The collaborations which began on those phone calls became networks, became coordination, became resource sharing, and an annual Becca conference, which now gets approximately 200 to or more, 200 or more from approximately equal numbers from both the state, from the justice community as well as the education community. And we've learned a lot about collaborations for better outcomes and getting to make policy recommendations with the support from MacArthur Foundation. So the other thing we've learned, we've learned better to get along since 1995, and also we've learned from research on trauma, traumatic circumstances in a child's life, which can put them at risk for that chronic absenteeism or truancy, and can also put them at risk for other negative consequences leading to the juvenile justice system. Adverse childhood experiences such as domestic violence in the home, mental illness, substance abuse, family dysfunction of all orders. We also learned about brain development and how that is impacted by trauma. Early childhood and adolescence, what exactly that research tells us about the development of the brain and the necessary stimuli and the necessary influences that a child needs in order to have a successful development through those early years as well as through adolescence. All of this impacts the child's ability to learn, and particularly the child who has critical needs and special needs. Some of this has already been addressed in the negative outcomes in the classroom that this slide talks about. But children and youth who disengage from school get on a path: chronic absenteeism, failing grades, antisocial behavior, including criminality, and dropping out. We know this by research. So what works? Well, what works in our experience is restorative justice, applying restorative justice principles to both schools and the justice system. The principle of restorative justice, quickly, because this is a whole other talk on itself, focuses on the rehabilitation of the offender within the context of repairing and reconciling the youth with his victim as well as her community. So it is infusing the attitude that harm has been done to both the victim as well as the community, that the child will be returning to the community and cannot be ostracized, stigmatized forever, or that results, obviously, in further negative behavior, not being attached to school, not being attached to positive role models, not being attached to peers who are engaged in pro-social activity. So this, the application of restorative justice principles in both the school buildings, Highline Public Schools being an example, but which has a bold initiative applying restorative justice techniques to discipline and discipline issues resulting in suspension and expulsion with bold goals to reduce all out-of-school suspensions, and they're on track to do so, and expulsions only where absolutely necessary to prevent harm to those in school or to the child himself. Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington has created a building culture where kids who were at this alternative high school, most of whom already were engaged in either the foster care system or the juvenile justice system or both, were treated with respect and taught the techniques to resolve conflicts throughout their building on daily problem solving, respect for each other and their differences. Peace circles is an example of restorative justice, although there are many that are applied in the juvenile justice system. It's not about blame. That's less important than understanding and accountability, letting the community speak to the offender, letting the offender speak back, but always with respect, and trying to work out what is the next step, what will hold you accountable, what will solve the issues going forward. Addressing basic supports, coordination with community-based organizations is absolutely necessary with the kids that we are describing who become involved in these systems. Again, this is not something that the school districts can or should do themselves, but partnerships are key. Many kids come into buildings not ready to learn. What we need to do is fill buildings, every school building, with caring adults with restorative justice attitudes and collaborations with community-based organizations which can provide or assist with providing basic supports like nutrition or access to mental health services that are so sorely needed by kids who become chronically absent. Strict adherence to IEPs, these individual education plans, and other individual plans, even where the child presents a behavioral challenge, not to risk safety of anybody in the building, but to ensure that the child will stay in the building and to engage the community at every step, including, by the way, the family members who are also members of the community. And lastly, an example in providing basic supports is leveraging mentor and tutor programs, also most of which are community-based organizations. It should not be a drain on the staff, but an asset to the building. Treehouse is a good example of a local organization which, though it works primarily with foster kids, a significant number of those kids that they work with also are involved in the juvenile justice system. They have a very bold initiative to get graduation rates at parity with non-foster youth and are meeting or exceeding that goal within the first 2 years of operation here in King County by the addition of educational advocates for the child and tutoring programs tailored to them. Community truancy boards. Community truancy boards have been around for a long time. They're a diverse group of people tailored to meet the needs of a child who will meet with a child and his family to get to a plan which is based on community accountability, and it's based on the community accountability boards which were used in the juvenile justice system for many years for low-level offenders, with the objective of keeping them out of court entirely by working for resolution of the case outside of the court, the court's rather strict formal settings. So this is like that, with groups of neighbors, some professionals, some not, culturally appropriate, who come together to effectively be the community's voice in addressing this family that we are not shunning out of our community because the child is having a problem, but whom we are bringing to that community and saying, how can we help? It is our responsibility as well as your responsibility to ensure that this child succeeds. A shout out to Spokane, Washington, who has one of the most vibrant and aggressive community truancy board sittings, and they have done training and done all over the country, as well as developing toolkits for any district to utilize community truancy boards. And last but not least in this setting is collaboration and communication between systems. This kind of relates to things that we've been talking about earlier. Acknowledging that this is the whole community's business and not just the schools, but that it very much is the business of the schools as well. Helping to address the social and emotional needs of these students. Partnerships with mental health services are an example of the Clark County Educational Service District partnering for years now, almost 20 years, with the Clark County Juvenile Court. Tri-Cities as well, accessing particularly mental health services for their children who are chronically absent or who are engaged in or who are engaged in the juvenile justice system. School, as I've said, schools are not cannot do it alone, but schools are the hub, the convener, the safe place, the symbol of a community that cares for the well-being of its children. Coming to the table with these folks and working together for policy change and resources that help kids to stay in school and graduate, have tools for it, and have tools for adulthood in which they thrive. One last note. Community truancy boards, through a bill passed in 2006, are now mandated for all districts beginning this next coming school year, and it is to be they are to be started directing memorandums of understanding between juvenile courts and the school districts throughout the state, at least those districts that are larger than 300 students in operation. Coordination and collaboration approach in this community truancy board is what we've been learning, and now it will be hopefully available all throughout the state. A newer piece of legislation has made some changes and updated 2449, requiring IEP teams to convene when considering absences for students with IEPs. So again, kind of that team approach, almost like a community truancy board setting. Certainly, it's like a peace circle or a restorative justice kind of notion. And requiring additional findings for courts before students can be detained for contempt and a truancy petition. They're again taking out the notion that this is a punitive action, but it is instead an intervention which is intent to make the student succeed. So unfortunately, there's a null and void clause there, and so it may run into McCleary funding. We certainly hope not. And we urge you, my last words before your questions, I urge you to use your considerable influences and knowledge to be heard on these issues. McCleary is about educational opportunities for all kids, including kids of color and kids whose history of trauma and adverse childhood experiences renders them at a high risk to disengage from school and to confront the juvenile justice system. It's not the best way, it's not the moral way, and it certainly is the most expensive way. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Justice Bridge. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Folks who are listening, please type your questions in the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen. And I want you to remember no question is too basic. If you're wondering what the answer is, I can guarantee you there are others who are attending this webinar who are wondering about the question. I'm going to start with one that I have. And that is, I am very interested in these community truancy boards. So when I just was wondering how it works a little bit more. So a student is out 20 days. Now they would at that point have to go to the school district and talk to usually they have to go and talk to
like my son before that.
But so when does the community truancy board occur in the cycle of a student being absent a fair amount? And when it happens, how does it work?
It happens at the same time that ordinarily the school district would have been required to file a petition. So instead of going to the court, ginning up a juvenile justice process, under this new law, the courts the schools would be required to instead invoke a community truancy board. That has been already now set up because this year, or actually almost 2 years now, has been given so that the local jurisdictions, the courts, and the schools can get together, establish their memorandums of understanding about how they're going to establish their community truancy boards, because they're not all the same.
Right.
They're not all the same in every district, and there are sometimes, and in best case scenario, in my opinion, they're tailored to the individual child. So, but there are certain commonalities. They are a combination of professionals and volunteers. There is usually a member who is from an employee of the school district, may know the family, certainly better than some of the others. The structure is a conversation about them. Now, this child also, according to the recommended policy in the bill, is that a child will have had an assessment of some sort. The assessment going to what are the reasons behind the absenteeism. That's what the focus is on. And that's where the issues begin to bubble up about what services might be, what combination of services might be put together to help this family. It could be something as serious as a mental health issue, a domestic violence issue, a substance abuse issue in the home, or it could be something which is serious but perhaps more easily solvable, and that is that the child is staying home in order to care for a sick parent or a sick relative or a younger child. And in that case, there's a different kind of community resource that would be applied. But so there's various levels of complexities, and hopefully the assessment is going to identify those levels of complexity and then have a conversation respecting the wishes and needs of the family and the child, obviously depending on the age of the child.
It's such a holistic approach.
It is.
Yeah.
And it works.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So here's a couple of questions from our listeners. What are your thoughts about the need for more diverse teaching and administrative staff in the schools? How would this impact the work?
Absolutely. I think one of the slides I was beginning to be worried that I was getting behind here talked about, where you're talking about community truancy boards. Specifically, I've called out culturally appropriate promising practices, and certainly I could add to that, kids will stay in school more likely to stay in school if they see people in front of the classroom that look like them, if they can visualize success. That has been shown by research over and over again as well. So the idea that not only culturally appropriate services and responses are brought to the table, but even before that, you're right, in the classroom, in the building, in day-to-day activity, kids are seen as valued and as having an opportunity to succeed.
Thank you. So how can we get involved in or participate on a community truancy board?
Well, check with your local school district. They should all either be in the business now of putting these school boards together. Frankly, we're not starting from scratch, as I again sort of implied just by a side comment about Spokane. There's been community truancy boards active in Clark County for many, many years. The Tri-Cities, the Seattle School Board also has one. Highline, Federal Way, and Kent, I believe, are still in operation with community truancy boards. Bellevue, I believe, is also still active with the community truancy board, that they are now, of course, retooling and doing according to whatever their needs are under this particular statute. But I would contact definitely your local school district. And great, glad to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question. In forestry, it is cheaper to prevent a fire than to fight it. How shall we encourage communities and schools to create a culture of success that embraces every child?
Wow. Well, part of it is a wonderful question, and I think there's a lot of different ways of approaching that. First of all is the data that I shared with you. That's kind of the rational part of this. It's costly. It's a limitation on human potential, which is also costly in the sense that, to the extent that these children are not being educated and not leading successful and independent lives, they're not contributing to their communities, they're not contributing to the tax base, and instead they are drawing down on services and not living to their own full potential. So that's the kind of rational ROI, if you will. But there's also the moral issue, which is that we are a community. We all live together, some of us in urban areas in very close-knit conditions, and trying to isolate people and saying, well, that's not my problem, it's your problem. It will be your problem if your neighborhood is unsafe as a result. It will be your problem if you as an employer cannot find enough educated employees to be able to carry out your mission, and as we as a society do not have enough of a critical mass of intelligent citizens who are able to vote for leaders who will lead this country to the highest quality that it can be, I think then we all lose. And so it's a communitarian approach maybe that I'm taking here, but I think that those kinds of arguments are what we need to be having at a national level and at a community level in order to embrace these concepts. But the data is there, and the cost effectiveness is also there for those of you who are still more interested in the rationality part of it.
Thank you. I'm going to do two more questions. Here's the first of the two. What do we know about schools with high-risk student populations, but they have low truancy rates? What's the best practices going on in those schools?
Well, I think we've talked about that. High-risk students, that's the Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, and that building has among other things, there are many different, it pays attention to who the teaching staff is, and that it does reflect, for example, the teaching staff as well as the non-certificated staff reflects the population racially and ethnically of the students within that high school. They have a culture of restorative justice, so that when disciplinary issues arise that might lead to suspension or expulsion, they're worked out in a format of conversation, and as opposed to a more justice-oriented kind of structure, a more formal structure of accuser and responder, but a focus on rehabilitating or repairing, in that case, repairing the circumstance that has given rise to the offense that might now lead to suspension or expulsion. Also infusing in just internecine warfare that happens in a high school, so that they do not become violence, they do not become physical confrontations, but that problem solving begins with respect for others and others' differences. Again, a restorative justice approach, all of which then is overlain with, especially for the professional, overlain with an attitude of what is trauma really about. We know that as high-risk kids have experienced a lot of trauma, that is going to mean that they are going to respond to certain stimuli in different ways, and to have that knowledge and to just be aware that a particular response may not be necessarily meant in the way that you are hearing it also adds to our knowledge of one another and our ability to build relationships. So it's a kind of a cocktail, I guess, or a stew, a mixture that really comes down to people-to-people interactions.
I'm going to do one more question. Can you speak to the impact of institutions' failure to comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act with regard to communication with limited English proficient parents?
I know that it happens. One of the things that is in, I believe it was initially in, I mentioned these two statutes at the very end. I believe it first appeared in 2449, which was the earlier one, but if not, it is for sure in 1170, which is the most recent bill and is a sort of a version, the most recent version, a revised version of 2449, calling forward some specific issues that really are not relevant to this conversation today. But one of the things that is required is communication with both written and oral communication prior to, as Kelly was asking earlier, about when you file your petition or when you convene your community truancy board. That communication with the parent must be in the language with which they are most familiar, if they are, for example, have dual language speakers. But what is most likely to communicate the situation and the circumstances that are confronting their child. So I think that's going to help in implementation of what we should be doing anyway.
Thank you so much, Justice Bridge. You're doing terrific work.
Lots of people are doing terrific work.
Yes, it always is, isn't it? It's always a lot. So thank you all. Our next LEVinar will be Thursday, July 20th at 12:30, and it'll be on APHIS, building off of this webinar today with David Lewis. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions or comments, please send them to kelly@educationvoters.org or info@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation along with the PowerPoint slides will be available on our website. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Again, thank you for attending, and we hope you'll join us again for our webinars.